Right. So we have 45 participants in at the moment. Good morning, everybody. My name is Dr. Alexander Gardner Mctaggart from the University of Manchester. I'm very pleased, in fact, I'm delighted this morning to be hosting this session on critical perspectives on experts and expertise in education policy. So, good morning, good evening, and good night for all of you all over the world. Welcome to this session, moderated by myself and hosted by the Manchester Institute of Education of the University of Manchester and co-hosted by the University of Western Australia's Educational Policy, Leadership and Practice Research Group and the University of Manchester's Critical Education Policy Group, also known as CEP. So, I'm delighted today to welcome onto our panel Bob Lingard, who is Emeritus Professor at the University of Queensland and Professor at the Australian Catholic University, notable scholar of globalising educational policy and educational reforms. His research uses policy sociology to explore global educational policy, schooling and school reform. Also, we have here this morning Sotiria Grek, who is Professor of European and Global Educational Governance at the University of Edinburgh. Her research focuses on an analysis of global education policy convergence through an examination of the mediating effects of national and local policies and practices. Also, we are delighted to host today Jessica Holloway, who is Senior Research and DECRA Fellow at the Australian Catholic University. She uses policy sociology and discourse analysis to interrogate notions of expertise, democracy, datafication, and teaching. Today, Stephen J. Courtney, who is a Senior Lecturer at the University of Manchester, who is co-organizer and organizer of this event, his research focuses on the critical sociology of educational leadership, where he explores and theorizes the interplay of structure, including policy, agency, and identities. And last but not least, Amanda Hefferman, who is lecturer in leadership at Monash University. Amanda's research takes a critical perspective towards school leadership, education policy, and the everyday experiences of educational leaders' work. Again, a special thanks today to Dr. Courtney for convening and organizing this event. And now I'm going to go straight into ground rules. We will base this session upon our submitted questions from our audience, which have been allocated panelists to you based upon specialization and interest. Each of you panelists will have up to 3 minutes to answer your question. I, in my function as moderator, will ensure that time limits are upheld with a 30-second reminder, and then I will interrupt you at exactly 3 minutes. While this is a relatively ungentle process, I ask all panelists and audience for your understanding, as this is a short and impactful session and we need to move through all of our questions. Upon conclusion of the question answer, I will open up the floor for directed comments and questions to our panelists. And I ask you please to formulate your contributions, audience, please, concisely. So, and without further ado, we move forward to the first question to Bob Lingard. Bob, who are the experts? Are educators experts? And this question comes from Sue Richards of Flinders University.
Thanks, Alex. I would say experts are those who have expertise, and expertise is perhaps of two kinds: a specialist knowledge and specialist skills. So expertise might be in relation to specialist knowledge, or it might be in relation to specialist skills, or indeed in relation to the two, skills and knowledges. I think in relation to educators, in the last few days, the IEA's TIMSS results have been released, and there's been some coverage of this in Australia. And one of the interesting findings is, in terms of 14-year-olds' math performance, is that the data, the Australian data, shows very clearly that those young people who have a maths teacher who has a degree in mathematics, that is, has specialist knowledge, plus have an education degree and specialist pedagogical content knowledge, what Schulman called pedagogical content knowledge, and the students who had teachers with those two sets of expertise outperformed all other students on TIMS in the Australian sample. And I think that's an example of educators, yes, as experts with expertise, and expertise of two kinds: the knowledge, the subject knowledge, and the pedagogical content knowledge.
Excellent and very concise answer. Thank you, Bob. So, Sotiria, the same question to you. Who are the experts? Are educators experts?
Morning, everyone, and thank you for being here today. Yes, my answer is unequivocally yes, educators are experts, and the way that I am defining expertise here is not just about having specialist knowledge, but the extent to which expertise can actually influence politics and policy. I think there was a time we would all agree that teachers' expertise, educators' expertise had more weight when professional expertise, professional judgment, practical knowledge, lay knowledge played a much more important role in influencing policy. In the last 20, 30 years, we've seen probably a move away from that into the consolidation of expertise in kind of certain kind of centers of calculation, like the OECD, like the World Bank, and several others, more recently large tech companies. Therefore, I would say that absolutely teachers have the expertise. The question is the extent to which this expertise is now respected. The question is the extent to their expertise actually having legitimacy. And it feels more and more that there is certain expertise that is valued far more than other. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sotiria, for that concise answer. And now, Jessica, over to you. Who are the experts? Are educators experts?
I'm on mute. There we go. Sorry about that. Yes, good morning, everybody. Good evening if you're here in Australia as well. Thank you for joining us today. I want to start by saying that I think when we talk about who are experts and what is expertise, that we have to remember that it's a political thing that we are talking about. The authority of expertise and who gets to count as an expert is authorized through political means, social means, historical means, geographic means, lots of ways that particular types of experts and particular types of expertise have been privileged over time. And we have to think about whose types of expertise, whose knowledge has been privileged and counted in those ways. And I think when we talk about teachers, this debate quickly goes to whether or not teachers are experts. And this actually sits squarely within my research space. And it's a question that I grapple with daily, really. And I think that what happens sometimes is that we are quick to defend teachers. I'm an advocate for teachers, especially teacher well-being, trusting teachers, especially when it comes to relationships with students and their local environments. However, I think that we also have to remember that teachers are also produced through various political and social and historical channels, whether that be through initial teacher education, how those are accredited, what types of knowledges are there that then shapes what teachers do. Because I think that if we look historically, schools have not always served all populations equitably, fairly, equally, and justly. And so I think that always has to be something that we think about when we do say that, yes, teachers are experts. Yes, we should trust their expertise. We should remember that expertise is often or always, political. And so the knowledge base that forms that expertise also has to be problematized, and we have to think critically about that as well. So I think that always has to be a part of the conversation, and I hope something that comes up throughout the conversation today. So
thank you very much, Jessica. Thank you. Amanda, over to you. Who are the experts? Are educators experts?
Thanks, Alex. I think I also just wanted to start by acknowledging that I'm zooming in from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. and to pay my respects to their elders past and present, and also recognise when we're talking about expertise, their ancestors were the first teachers on the lands that we now call Australia, and there's lots of different types of expertise that are recognised and valued within, you know, different discourses and different cultures, particularly relating to education. And I think that's a really important starting point that Jess made around problematising the concept of expertise kind of in and of itself. And so when I was thinking about how I would respond to this question, I was thinking about Stephen Ball's recent paper about the absurdity of policy. If you haven't read it yet, it's in Critical Studies, I think, and it's really fantastic. And in that paper, he talked about the importance of actually setting expertise aside so that we can go back to that idea of getting lost in the research and not make assumptions about our work and the people that we're working with. I think it can be really seductive to be an expert and to kind of know what we're looking for and to know, you know, be able to theorize things really well and understand different contexts. But I think also, I guess, when we're building on research that we've done for a really, really long time in a particular niche, but that idea of embracing kind of not knowing, and he quotes Lather to talk about getting lost in the research so that we can produce different kinds of knowledge. But the thing I'm trying to get to is also so that we can work differently when we're producing knowledge. And I think that comes back to the question of, are teachers experts, are educators experts? So I work really closely with principals associations and with principals directly, principals who I was once a principal alongside. And so our work is very much partnership driven. They're very much long-term research partners of mine, where our work kind of reflects our shared values and expertise and goals. But their expertise, if I can step back from my kind of idea as a policy leadership expert, it really challenges me to think differently about the work that they're doing and the work that I'm doing, and to kind of be okay in that really messy space of uncertainty and not being sure about what's coming next, or, you know, what we're going to investigate next, or what we're going to find next. So I think we get the best results when we work with educators. So their expertise in the everyday, within context, and our big picture view, our immersion in, you know, a particular field of research or our understanding.
30 seconds.
Really powerful combination. That was my end.
Thank you very much, Amanda. And now over to you, Steve, for that same question. Who are the experts? Are educators experts?
Thank you very much, Alex. Well, for me, this is a question of how, by whom and for what purposes knowledge about education is produced, and how, by whom and for what purposes this knowledge is recognised, acclaimed and promoted. So that second element means that the question is, as Jess says, deeply political. Since the notion of valorisation is distinct from that of legitimacy. I'm coming at this from the perspective of a Bourdieusian scholar. So in a Bourdieusian framing, it's not enough simply to possess a great deal of knowledge about a topic. Expertise is also a form of symbolic capital whose existence requires acknowledgement by the field. And that means in the field as well as by field members. And so we need to think carefully about what we mean by field. Education can easily be argued to constitute a field, but it's comprised of multiple overlapping fields. Sociology of education policy might be one of them. Education practice, educational leadership, all of these can be argued to be distinctive Bourdieusian fields. It may be that this is consequential for claims of expertise and also for their recognition. Educators' expertise may be recognised in the classroom, in the staff room, hopefully in head teachers' offices, principals' offices, but not so much by policymakers. And so this is a question of policy and politics, as I mentioned earlier, and Jess, but also of ideology. The question of whom to position as expert produces answers that further or impede ideological agendas. That's why education knowledge produced in universities has also been constructed occasionally as problematic. We had an education secretary in the UK from 2010 onwards for a number of years, Michael Gove. He characterised as the blob academics who critiqued his policies, and we have some very proud members of the blob in our audience today. And so really to sum this up,
30 seconds, Steve.
That falls well. The experts in education are those who generate knowledge through practice or research, and that's got to be recognised by field members, which, by the way, can be children. This expertise doesn't have to be recognised by policymakers, who are arguably in a overlapping but distinct field. However, if it's not recognised, then you can assume that that knowledge is dangerous, potentially, to policymakers, which seems a good enough reason to pursue it. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Perfect. Exactly 3 minutes. Well done. Now, Bob, over to you again, please. What is the relationship between experts and expertise and democratic and public accountability? And that question comes from Professor Helen Günther of the University of Manchester.
Thanks, Alex. So I suppose if we begin from the assumption that all policy is always an admixture of expertise, research, data, evidence, but also values, politics, ideology, plus also, particularly in terms of the production of policy, but also in terms of its enactment, professional knowledges. So every policy is an admixture of that. So expertise, like data, like research, like evidence, can only ever be for policy, not as policy, because we have the political process in the centre, whereby the political process sets the broad agenda, then the policy is produced through the logics of practice of the state, and then it is enacted. So in terms of public accountability, if we go back to Weber, expertise can't and shouldn't, it must be a factor like research, data, evidence in the production of policy, but it can't be the only factor. Otherwise we'd have a technocracy rather specifically than a democracy. One of the problems, of course, with accountability, the way it functions in schooling systems today, is that it's been top-down, test-based, done to teachers. The field of judgment's been taken away from teachers, and some of that context that Sotiria outlined earlier. So I think we also, in terms of democracy, need to challenge this dominant way accountability currently functions, and we also need to reconceptualize another model. So I think in a way, those at the school site have a right to make claims upon the policymakers, the politicians, about what is required for them to achieve policies that they are to enact. And this is opportunity to learn standards, as some have called it. But I also think a broader accountability would be between schools and their communities, the schools to their communities and the communities to their schools. In a large project I did in Queensland a couple of years ago, we worked with 8 schools to reconstruct a model of accountability, and they wanted the right to speak back to the politicians. They wanted to be involved with their community, and the community to have a right to make demands of them. So I think it's a complex relationship between expertise and policy making. And I think the area, certainly in Australia, where expertise has no impact on policy making really is in climate change, where the government pours ahead against all of the evidence as such.
Thank you very much, Bob. Excellent, also precisely 3 minutes. Sotiria, please, same question. What is the relationship between experts and expertise and democratic public accountability?
Yes, thank you. I mean, this is a really complex question, Helen, and I think one that we could be discussing for years. Just 3 minutes. I think my answer in these 3 minutes, we'll try to have like it will be kind of a two-pronged answer. For a very long time, expertise has been accountable through its legitimacy as scientific, robust knowledge. So if we go back to kind of the mode 1 to mode 2 kind of frame, peer review, for example, for us as academics, is the way that we become accountable for our work. Of course, as we know, the last 20, 30 years, expertise is not just about producing scientific knowledge, it is valued on its usability, on its applicability for policy making. And there is where all the problems begin. Problems, I mean, the really interesting political problems, as Jessica said, there's no evidence making that is not political, because there we have problem, the question of access, of conflict of interest, of experts kind of walking this tightrope between independence and kind of distance from power versus kind of the relevance and the usability of the research. We have questions of patronage, who pays for the production of knowledge, and of course of conflict of interest, and that we see more and more, if you like, especially in the context of the pandemic. So the question here is, I think, how we can make expertise more accountable and more transparent at its production. But I think it's almost impossible to actually do so, because it's such a complex field of personal, kind of individual career aspirations in combination with the epistemic culture of institutions, institutions with long history like the World Bank or the OECD that come with kind of their own brand of epistemic legitimacy, and of course the political context itself and what kind of knowledge it requires to take certain decisions. The second part of my answer is that, I mean, I'm doing currently quite a lot of research on the production of the SDG4, and I think I saw Clara here somewhere in the audience at some point. So we wrote a chapter in the World Yearbook of Education with Clara on kind of this experts in the SDG4 field trying to kind
30 seconds.
Navigate political and technical accountability. There, what we see the UNESCO is doing, UIS, is bringing more and more actors in order to democratize the process of the production of knowledge. But of course, as you can understand, there are huge power differentials and many questions about is it real participation? Is it real democracy, or is it just a facade? But I'll just stop here. I would love to discuss more on this with all of you if possible.
Thank you, Sotiria. Over to Amanda now. What is the relationship between experts and expertise and democratic public accountability?
I think it's really easy to feel powerless at the moment. So my initial thought on reading this question was to despair about the state of public accountability at all. But I think that we do still have the opportunity to hold public policy to account as critical researchers. And I think that's, a really, really important part of public accountability, because we can make comment about, where policy is falling short. We can still influence discourses more broadly about education. And I think our voices are still heard, even though it doesn't always feel like we're being listened to. And I think that's a really important thing to remember. So I've done some work with politicians on both sides of the fence and policymakers, and it's been really fruitful once I've worked out how to pitch the issues and my research to them. So that made an enormous difference in me kind of even being invited to the table. I couldn't make people listen until I was able to really rethink about how I can describe how my work is relevant. And I think that's difficult for critical researchers because we don't give easy solutions. And, we know that that's often what people are looking for in those positions. And I think an interesting kind of way of thinking about this question, Helen, I'm not sure if this is what you were kind of getting us to think about, but I went off perhaps on a tangent, talking with some colleagues about accountability for our own work too. So we're researchers working at public institutions, we're more often than not funded by public money, which Sotiria has also mentioned as well. And so we have these conversations often about the accountability for the sort of research we do or what we do with our research. And I think that might depend on the type of research that we do, perhaps. So for me, my work is about attraction and retention, issues of well-being, issues of workload. And so the people that I'm talking to are already at the end of a really, really stretched thin rope, and I'm asking them to sit down and talk to me and give up their time. So I'm accountable to them in terms of what I do with my research, to value the time that they've given up to share their experiences with me as well. And I think the problem with this conversation is that it stretches into potentially really dangerous territory about the type of work that researchers should do. You know, we have the potential of straying into an impact agenda and not, you know, still pursuing knowledge for its own sake. And I'm potentially dancing quite close to a line there, which I don't want to do. But that idea
30
of...
seconds, Amanda.
Thanks, Alex. You're very good at this. That idea of who we're accountable to and how we're accountable as part of the bigger process is something that I think is really interesting and kind of grounds my thinking more and more in this space.
Thank you very much, Amanda. Right, now we move on to question number 3, which comes from Dr. Stephen Rayner of the University of Manchester. How can metrics, data, and digital tools contribute to understanding teacher expertise, while at the same time having credibility with teachers? And this question now goes to Sotiria, please.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a difficult question to answer. I think that the answer probably lies with trying to bring expertise, if we could, away from these large international comparative assessments, which, you know, have their own qualities, their own effects, but much closer to the classroom, and there try to combine, to the extent that we can, kind of quantitative knowledge produced, kind of the metrics and data, which is of course absolutely valuable, with qualitative data kind of generated by teachers and other researchers in the classroom. I think the problem for a very long time is that kind of the quantification, kind of and we'll probably say this more in the years to come, kind of this explosion of big data and algorithmic governance have moved us further and further away from kind of the nitty-gritty of actually doing the research in the classroom, observation, you know, the very, very important tools of qualitative research that many of us in education research know very well. So I think really kind of moving back and trying to produce kind of more mixed methods research would be a way of doing that. Going back to the SDG 4 and the production of different targets with especially countries of the global south, there, I mean, what I see as quite an optimistic kind of move is that many of these countries do not seem to go anymore with kind of top-down agendas. They just want to be much more involved in the production of knowledge, and they want the knowledge that they produce to be usable and meaningful for them. And there we see also kind of this push back on developing global comparable metrics and try to make them much more local and relevant. I wish I could tell you that you know, I can see this happening, and you know, it's actually quite tough the more we move into you know, the influence of these large educational technology companies, but still I think we as educators, we as academics that produce
30 seconds, Sotiria.
Produce knowledge in this field, I think we should try to persuade people in international organizations, other experts, of the absolute necessity for qualitative information. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Again, now over to Jessica, please. How can metrics, data, and digital tools contribute to understanding teacher expertise, while at the same time having credibility with teachers?
Thanks, Alex. So again, I'll echo Sotiria's thoughts about this being a very complicated and complex question. And I think I'd like to start by talking a little bit about the relationship between data, metrics, and teacher expertise, because this is kind of at the heart of the project I'm working on and have been for the past couple of years. And part of that project has been talking to teachers in the UK, Australia, and the US about how they use data, how they use metrics to inform practice, and how it shapes what they do. And increasingly what I'm finding is that while we say there's no good data, it's just how we use it. Like, I don't disagree with the premise, but I don't know if we fully grasp the ontological shift that has happened in schools in terms of what data are and who teachers are in terms of data. So when I talk to teachers about expertise, or, what makes an expert teacher, how do you know you're an expert, these sorts of questions, more and more I'm seeing teachers align how they judge their own expertise with how well it aligns with what the data are saying about their practice and their students. And the irony that I find particularly interesting is that a lot of times this is happening in schools, and the school sites in particular that I have done field work at, where they will tell me flat out, we know that data are just numbers. They don't tell the whole story. We care about the whole student. These are the things that we care about. But then in the very next sentence, when I ask about teacher judgment, it is completely aligned with what the numbers have said. Oh, my judgment has gotten better over time. I've gotten better at predicting what the data are going to say. And so I think that as researchers, while we can hold on to the notion that there's no bad data, it's just how we use it, I can respect the view. But I think that we need to be a bit more realistic sometimes about, like I said, the ontological shift and where teachers are learning this, because this is coming from, training a lot of times, and not at the fault of, professors who are, creating those courses, but a lot of times coming from, government mandates, accreditation requirements, whatnot, where teachers are required to learn how to be data-driven.
Jessica.
And so when they get into classrooms, this is completely normal to them. The discourse of data is normalized. So to think of not thinking in that way, we're asking them, I think, sometimes to do something that's not even possible, because we have taught them that this is how you do teaching. And a lot of them have grown up in systems where testing metrics and data are how schools are oriented and assembled. So just some thoughts about that. Sorry if it didn't answer the question precisely, but I think thinking about that relationship is very important as well.
Thank you very much, Jessica. Now we move on to question number 4.
Alexander, sorry, can I be rebellious, the naughty pupil, and just add 30 seconds to the previous question? Is that okay?
Okay, we saved some time at the beginning, so you can, yes.
Thanks. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I couldn't agree more with you, Jessica. About 10 years ago, I was doing a lot of research in schools here in Scotland to examine Higgios, this framework, how good is our school? And I just couldn't believe that I couldn't get them past talking about the work that they do. They were using completely the formal policy discourse and that kind of language. And it was almost like couldn't think outside of that box, and I just found it so frustrating. So it was almost, I was trying to tell them, okay, now you gave me the official spiel, now tell me what it is that you do, but it was almost impossible. So one, I think, responsibility that we have as educators of teachers to be is to teach them to think critically and think outside of the box. Anyway, sorry, Alexander. Thank you.
Thank you, naughty student, but an excellent contribution. Thank you very much. Now we move on to question number 4. There is an emerging and ongoing concern about what is termed a cancel culture. How might the knowledge and contributions of experts and expertise be retained against a backdrop of these discourses? And this question comes from Professor Tanya Fitzgerald of the University of Western Australia, and that is directed now, please, towards Jessica.
Okay, sorry, everybody, you have to hear me back to back. But I love this question. I think it's an excellent question. It's something I think about often, and I feel like I get into conversations, sometimes kind of debates about it with some colleagues and friends, because I don't believe that cancel culture is a real thing. I think it is a rhetorical device that's being used to silence people who have not been able to speak historically. And I think that's something as an academy, I think that we have a responsibility to recognize that. So my response is framed by that premise. My second point is that this question made me think of this really kind of silly aha moment that I had last week, that, we say PhD, but oftentimes we forget that that's a doctor of philosophy. Like, we are philosophers. And sometimes I do think that we chase what Amanda brought up earlier, the impact agenda in our work gets shaped by, making sure that we're responding and that we're relevant and we're, being listened to and that we are counted as experts and that, what we do matters. And I believe that that's a honorable pursuit. But I think that we should also embrace the fact that we are philosophers. So when we talk about cancel culture, like, I think it's very fair and necessary for society, for the public, for us to embrace that part of our role and responsibility as well. And so we should be thinking critically. We should be thinking big ideas. And I think that as an academy, we should think more holistically about what impact means. I don't think we should necessarily be all trying to convince each other that we should be doing research because that's more impactful or that's more important. It's okay that somebody's work is more practical. I don't do very practical work. I'm not good at offering, pointers as to how to do policy better. I'm a critical scholar, but I think there's an important role for that. And I hope that my work can help inform those who are doing work. And I think that if we begin to think of, academia and our role and impact more holistically and collectively in that way, then we can actually be more impactful. And I think that when we think about cancel culture, we remember the roots of why certain types of expertise and certain types of knowledges have been silenced. And just because we're giving more space for others to speak out. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. But as we are more critical about who's been able to speak and who has provided platforms, I think that as an academy, we should just remember that cancel culture is, I think, about silencing that speech, and we should be critical and careful that we don't contribute to it.
Thank you, Jessica.
Thanks,
Perfect, and on the dot at 3 minutes. Now we move over to Steve Courtney. There is an emerging and ongoing concern about what is termed a cancel culture. How might the knowledge and contributions of experts and expertise be retained against the backdrop of these discourses?
Thanks, Alex. Well, as Jess outlined, this is a complex and contemporarily contentious issue. Belief in the very existence of a cancel culture has become a shibboleth, which positions us binarily. And so some example narratives that seem to have taken hold that I've seen recently. Well, there's one that says that those on the left see the term as a straw man construction deployed by the right to smear the left's attempts to eradicate hate speech. And another one is that those on the right denounce what they call wokery in all its forms, regardless of merit, by reducing each instantiation of wokery to just an opportunity for demanding the right to offend. And in this kind of framing, the claim is always for free speech, but the objective is always to cause offence. And such offence might be experienced and articulated as literal violence. So, I mean, I've seen both of these positions actually out there on Twitter, but I do think there's a far more nuanced grey area in between. Some academics have had their invitation to present and debate withdrawn, but some of those have been left-leaning. For example, Professors Rosa Friedman and Selina Todd, both of whom were speaking within their area of expertise, which was gender. I mean, the gender is not a distraction from our focus today on education policy, as Kay Fuller and Marion Coleman would confirm. But I want to broaden the discussion to take into account what I think cancel culture really is. And I follow Jess here, and we didn't compare notes, any of us, before we started talking, but you'll see the resonances. I don't think cancel culture is a thing, but I think that the impulse to silence is a thing, and is long-standing and is alive and well in education policy. I've got two brief examples. The first one is through what Ball called the discourse of division, whereby arguments for comprehensivization and public schooling were rendered unthinkable and unsayable through policy interventions that were supported by the media. And thinking again with my Bourdieuian hat on,
30 seconds, Steve.
It's clear that the knowledge that was produced there might have been valued, but it certainly wasn't true. Second example, briefly, was the creation of the National College for School Leadership in England in 2000, where one sole site for producing knowledge about educational leadership was created, and dissenting voices were silenced. And Helen Gunter was written about this in her 2012 book, Leadership and the Reform of Education. So the impulse to silence is going strong. The role of experts is to do what experts have always done in times of discursive marginalisation: find new audiences and new means to articulate the message and plough on regardless.
Thank you very much. Right, we move on to our final question now. This is directed at Bob, Amanda and Steve, and this comes from Glenn Savage of the University of Western Australia. To what extent, now Bob, do you believe that academics have a responsibility to use their expertise to engage in forms of public intellectualism?
Thanks, Alex. An excellent question. My answer is yes, and I'm assuming public intellectualism relates to the participation of academics in the media and in political debates. But my position here draws on Bourdieu, and he makes the point that a scholarship, there are particular logics of practice, they're a field. And if we look at politics, there are different logics of practice. And his point is yes, particularly in the contemporary times, that there needs to be commitment to act as public intellectuals by academics. But, and I think he is absolutely right here, it means that the academic involvement as a public intellectual in public debates, media presentations, is not as a politician, but is drawing upon the logics of scholarship and the knowledge that comes out of our research and all of the bodies of literature and so on. And I think there's a real danger here with the impact agenda on universities, the push for a sort of instrumentalizing of knowledge. I think somewhere Bourdieu said that understanding gravity was central to planes flying. And I think our academic knowledge, understanding, and the way we use that as public intellectuals in the public sphere it is very important. So there is a danger, I think, and I know when I get contacted by the media, I try to say, I'll only talk about topics I know about. Bourdieu was critical of Sartre as a total intellectual who had an opinion on every social occurrence, every political event, and was in the media about it. But rather, I certainly try to just use my area of expertise, and I try only to speak in that domain. And I try to enter the debate with a particular set of values, but enter it and participate in it, not as a politician, but bringing the knowledge and what all of our field is, the knowledge that's been produced in that I and everybody has been involved in, how that can help us understand the situation and maybe have implications for action.
Thank you very much, Bob. And now we move on to Amanda, please, for the same question. To what extent do you believe that academics have a responsibility to use their expertise to engage in forms of public intellectualism?
Like Bob, I also thought about media, engaging in media appearances as well. And I've been doing more and more of that kind of public intellectual work in recent years. And as a school principal, I was terrified of ending up in the media. It was like always the thing that I wanted to avoid. And so I had to really unlearn that kind of fear of engaging in that space. So I did media training, and they told me that I was considered an expert in education and I could comment on anything in education. And like Bob, I refuse to do that. I really do stick to what I believe is my expertise and the evidence that I can really draw upon to do that work kind of ethically, I think. The thing that I thought about when I saw this question was, there's a principal that I work with quite frequently in research projects, and he refers to the work that we do as intellectual whistleblowing. He says that he would be fired for speaking out about the sorts of things that he's able to share in research interviews because of the sort of work that we do together. And so he said to me once that he really relies on me to be able to share those stories that he's not able to share. And I think that lends a real weight to the work that I do and the kind of way that I decide to engage, whether it's in the media, whether it's in translational stuff in different avenues, and also where I publish my research as well. But that is something that more and more I kind of keep at the forefront of my mind while I'm thinking about being a researcher. And the other thing that I thought was quite relevant here is Michael Apple's key tasks for critical scholar activists that Steve actually came and shared at Monash and got a rousing response from. But he talks about the fact that, you know, we're standing on the shoulders of people who have done all of this work before us. The unseen labour that is happening to enable us to be researchers, the time that people are giving us. And so we do have a responsibility, I think, to be more public in sharing that work and in advocating for people. We can't be neutral in these situations, you know, and I know this all depends on the sort of work that you do, but that's the way that I think about this. And so he talked about the fact that it's really important that we develop these skills of being a public intellectual, a public academic, communicating our research effectively. And
30 seconds.
Thank you. He says the right are very good at this and the left have to get better at it to be able to counter the sorts of discourses that are coming through. And I would say about education in particular. And I think that that's really important for us to keep in mind.
Thank you very much, Amanda. And now the same question to Steve. To what extent do you believe that academics have a responsibility to use their expertise to engage in forms of public intellectualism?
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, I think that broadly, yes, they do. I would like to unpack intellectualism a bit, maybe not here, but just for the convenience of this webinar, I might think of it in terms of public engagement with intellectual debates and issues in our field. The reasons for this broad agreement are as follows. I suppose, first of all, if academics don't, then we see who will. The space is filled regardless. Twitter's full of the inexpert but loud, and also of the generalized so-called expert of no particular field, and yet all, as the occasion demands, rent an opinion, you might call them. And so a number of the panelists have drawn attention to the dangers of that and to the necessity of staying in your field of expertise. Second, I think engaging in this way helps us as academics to counter a trope of the academy, which is that we're all in our ivory tower and we don't engage. And so Mike Apple's advice speaks to this very clearly. I've seen kind of vaguely sniffy characterizations as well, though, of the sort of research that critical researchers do as being it's activism. It's not actual research, it's activism, and therefore is on a different ontological level as well as anything else. I mean, to be honest, I don't agree with the sneer, but I think that the activism is probably true. If we are socially critical researchers, then we are working to improve the social world in some way, and so that involves work. So Michael Apple has been incredibly helpful in getting us to think about what that involves and what the intellectual warrant for that engagement is. But I think that he's entirely right, and I intend taking him up on it.
Thank you very much. Very concise there. Thank you, all panelists. Those were very, very quick answers to very weighty questions. I think that was a very intense and densely packed conversation there. Now, I do apologize for
that's why.
Good, excellent. I do apologize for interrupting you all, for disturbing your flow and for cutting you off. However, we got there. Now, that means that we have 12 minutes to turn to our audience and ask for audience questions. So audience, now you have two options. If you feel comfortable, please just speak, open your microphone and ask a question. If you would prefer, you may also put a question into the message bar, which I can read out for you. So audience, over to you. Well, I think, panelists, you have stunned everyone into silence with your robust intellectualism. I too would find it difficult to follow that.
I think Colin has a question.
Colin, excellent. Colin, please. Yeah, Colin, you might be on mute.
Is that okay?
We can hear you.
Yeah, I apologize. There's another meeting going on. It's actually in Australia, so they're all being incredibly polite, but there's a bit of pinging going on. Please tell me if that just gets annoying. I want to say thank you. I mean, that was just absolutely fantastic, and it's a wonderful time. The people from my bookshelves are now in my living room. It's a comment, really. I think it's a comment. Most of my questions are comments, but it's something that Jessica said, which really struck me about ontology. And I've been thinking a lot about ontology. What are we doing? What are we looking at? And Bob's recent paper and also Stephen Ball's recent paper has really helped me. And I think you kind of got it for me, Jessica, when you said, you know, when you're talking to teachers about knowledge, a word that we haven't kind of used all that much. It's dipped in and out, but I think that's another session, Steve and Alex. You know, what is knowledge? Who are the knowers? And I think your issue about what teachers talk about, I think is certainly something that I would align with. And that's not just because I've read your work. You know, the knowledge has become the data, you know, to just draw from the little patch that I've worked in and Helen and I have written about. In primary school literacy in England, the data has become the knowledge and has become the curriculum. That's no big surprise because it's the same people who are doing things. But I think it makes me reflexive and open, not lashing myself, but it makes me face up to those who would be critical of us. One of them is Michael Apple, who says that we don't focus enough on knowledge, we don't focus enough on curriculum. And the other, the Carl Mayton, the Paulo Singh, you know, that gang, they say that what we talk about is sociology of knowers. What we don't dig into is the sociology of knowledge. And I think the point that you made, Jessica, really drove it home for me. You know, it's the knowledge that's changed. That's where the ontological shift is. So, for example, drawing, as I say, from my own specialist interest, people don't talk about reading and writing anymore. Primary school teachers, they talk about tests. So, you know, I don't think it's a question even, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Colin. Excellent. Now, you've got everyone going there, Colin. So thanks for that contribution.
Good.
We
That's
have now, great. So we have a question here, and panelists, do feel free to chip in if you think this is something you'd like to talk about. From Margaret Marukayan. How do you think the social media plays a role, or doesn't, in defining who are the knowers and how the knowledge is developed?
Well, I don't mind saying something on this briefly. And first of all, that's to say that social media is not a democratic space, particularly for producing knowledge. We need to recognise the costs involved of trying to work in that space, especially for women and people of colour. And so it is incredibly structuring, and we do see the same old voices, and we see not just trauma, we see bullying, we see harassment, we see all sorts of things, which mean that it's really quite challenging to produce knowledge and to get conversations going and to have respectful conversations on social media, and then to talk later about how that has been to people who might not experience social media in the same way.
Excellent, thank you. Sotiria, please.
Thank you. That worries me a lot, to be honest, this notion of the celebrity academic. And what worries me most is kind of what I see as the dangers of populism through expertise. Not so much in our field, I have to say. I haven't seen this so much in education, which is fantastic. But judging from the field of public health and the last year over COVID, we've seen a lot of experts acquiring like this almost celebrity status on Twitter and other social media, and offering actually not really helpful commentary at all. It lacks nuance because it has to be loud, and then you know, there are all sorts of problems. At the moment in the UK, there's a big discussion about borders and closing the borders, and a lot of public health experts talk about closing the borders without really understanding the effects that this has on, you know, bordering and on constructing the other. And, you know, it's really, really difficult to watch, actually. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sotiria. Now I'm going to move swiftly on to another question here from Ruth Davies. How should teachers and school leaders be engaging with the expertise of academics? Should we seek a more direct route, or is it okay that it's diverted through policymakers and, in brackets, thinking about wanting to be critical in our work? So which of our panelists would like to start off with that one?
Me and Amanda are having a face-off. Okay. I think it's understandable that it's mediated in this way. And I started out in school leadership, and I can remember the first encounters I had with research were this National College brochures and leaflets and digested research commissioned by Tame researchers that got put into my pigeonhole, and that was, I had no idea how to access it other than that. And so it was only by doing my master's that I started to get a glimpse of the roots into this world. And so access is a huge issue. School leaders are extremely busy, teachers are extremely busy. And so we need to make these pathways more obvious and easier to navigate. So that is part of the public engagement work, actually, that we need to do. As an addendum to that question on public engagement, it's not reducible to appearing in the media and arguing on Twitter. I think this strand is also terribly, terribly important.
Excellent, thank you. Amanda, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I suppose just building on what Steve said rather than repeating it, we love when people contact us. We're desperate for engagement with practitioners, and so you know, once you kind of make contact with the names of people that are kind of doing work that resonates with what you want to know more about or what you want to talk about or think about, directly getting in touch with an academic is, I think, quite a fruitful thing. We'll tend to respond and share our work really happily.
Thank you very much. Now, just to finish up on and to bring Bob and Jessica back in again, here's a question from Arpeen, and I'm going to murder this name, unfortunately. I'm going to try my best. Bagdasarayan, I hope I said that correctly. Apologies if I didn't. The question is, hi everyone. Thank you for the webinar. I wonder, in the context of decolonization, how policy will be developed and implemented both in Global South and North. Any lines of prediction? If we can start with Jessica, please, and then move over to Bob. And that will be our last question, ladies and gentlemen, today.
Okay, thanks, Alex. Such a good question, Arpeen. And I don't think I'm going to have any lines of prediction, but I think I'll kind of circle back actually to one of the things that I said at the very beginning of this when I was introducing who counts as experts. And I think if we look historically, we know what type of expertise has been valued and what type of knowledge has been valued historically, because expertise and who is the expert is a social, a political, a historical, a geographic construct, then, you know, Anglo-Western male thinking leaders, experts have been valued and privileged as the knowers. And I think this has tremendous implications when we think about the relationship between the global North and the global South and policy. And then those of you who study more globalization type things could be able to speak to this much more authoritatively. Bob, I'm sure you can do that, but I do think that when we think about experts, experts and expertise, when we identify as experts, I think that we should remember how our own kind of privileged positions contributes to that power dynamic, and that we need to problematize again how expertise gets authorized and how particular that's it. Experts have been accepted as such over time.
Thank you very much, Jessica, for that.
Thanks.
And moving over to Bob now, please.
I think there's something really interesting to think about here in terms of data and the move across the globe. I mean, if you take say, the OECD and PISA and an aspiration to cover all the systems on the globe with a particular test, and the way data works in relation to that, I think there's and then who collects the data, what private companies, businesses, ed techs and so on are involved in. I think there's the real potential for a colonization rather than decolonization to occur in terms of the datification of the globe and making the entire globe a commensurate space of measurement. So I think there's a politic that needs to speak back to that. And I say that I was always taken by the last sentence in Thomas Piketty's book, where he says that denial of numbers has not been to the advantage of the most disadvantaged. So I think there's an interesting politic in all of that. But I think, as Nick Coldry and his colleague have been arguing recently, there's a sort of colonization going on beyond sort of surveillance capitalism, but in the education system with all of this data and single measures and so on. And I think there's some interesting speaking back to that as a decolonizing project that is really needed and needed desperately.
Thank you, Professor Bob Lingard, for those final and now closing words to this highly interesting and impactful session, which I'm sure you will agree it was. Now, I would like to invite all of the audience to make use of their internet search and email skills to look up each and every one of these panelists at their university websites, and feel free, please, to email them any questions that you might have or any follow-ups. They will be more than willing and happy to respond to you if you reference this session here, please, and relate your question directly to it. I would like, please, now all of the audience, if you could, to give a round of applause virtually to our panelists by either making use of the applause function in Zoom. Excellent. We have numbers going up there, 29, 32, 33, applause, huge applause also coming from the panelists themselves too, even love hearts and all manner of celebration going on there. I thank you all very much, particularly Dr. Steve Courtney, for organizing this event, and I wish you all a very good day.